Ladies and gentlemen, today I wanted to talk a little bit about a handheld that just came in the other day, and I went to check it out. I had some okay expectations for it, but in all honesty, this Retroid Pocket 4 Pro has kind of blown me away with what it's able to do with some of the features, and I kind of feel like this is, for me anyway, the big aha moment for the Retroid line, which hasn't necessarily been one that's really clicked with me in the past, as I have picked up things like the Retroid Pocket 2 and 3, but the 4 Pro just is on seemingly a next level, and I wanted to go over some of my thoughts here today, as well as some things I think they can improve in, specifically on the internal side, especially when it comes to cooling the device. So if you guys enjoy this video, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe if you're new. So if you're unaware, the Retroid Pocket 4 was announced right at the end of, or like fourth quarter of last year. I got my pre-order in December, and it actually just showed up this past week. So it took a while to ship out, technically. But we can see the Retroid Pocket 4 and 4 Pro handheld. Now, the Pro, I have that selected, is $200, whereas the regular one is $150. I will say, though, looking at the specifications, they also have all kinds of accessories they, of course, try to sell you. But I will at least say that this grip for $15 might not be a bad pickup based on some of my experience with it. But here are the specifications for it. So we have the Pro at the top. We have the regular one here. The Pro, I feel like, is worth the extra $50. It has twice the amount of RAM with 8 gigabytes of LPDDR4X versus 4 gigabytes. And the CPU and GPU, the quad-core A78 at 2.6 gigahertz versus the dual-core. And then the GPU, the G77 versus G68. It's quite a jump in terms of its capabilities for emulation, which is really what this thing is for, right? So when I saw the Pro, I thought to myself, that looks like it would work well as a portable GameCube and PlayStation 2 player. So that's basically what I wanted to get this for, and that's primarily what I focused on as I was going through this handheld with some of the tests for it. But just based on the benchmarks and other things with these GPUs, I mean, we're talking about a separation of like 80%. So it's the G77 being potentially 80% more capable in certain benchmarks. Again, I think if you're investing in it, it's worth just picking up the Pro for all that. But when it did come in, it has the typical Retroid box, which if you've picked any of the ones up previously, you know what I'm talking about. It opens up on one side with a flap, and then it folds open to where there's this plastic window, which is weird because you can't see the system. Now, it's not necessarily a bad thing because what they've done here is put a foam padding on the front of the device, so it tries to protect the screen and other parts of the front faceplate from shipping, but it also kind of negates the need for that window. So it's an interesting decision, but it even has cutouts for the joysticks and the buttons, so it does fit flush against the front of the system. So package-wise, it was pretty good in terms of setup and trying to protect it in shipping. But other than that, you have a pretty slim manual that's mostly just a quick start guide, and then also going over the specifications for your device, and then a USB-C to Type-A. A charge cable, no power brick, and that just seems to be a common thing nowadays. I guess they figure you're going to either plug it into your PC and charge it there while you transfer files, or you already have a bunch of power bricks, which, I mean, in that case, I technically do, but still, you spend $200 on something like this, you'd like to see at least a cheapo brick just be included. But then looking around the device, it's a pretty symmetrical front. We have the D-pad on the top left, we have A, B, X, and Y in typical fashion on the top right, 2 different joysticks underneath of each, and then at the bottom right and bottom left, we have home, back, then select and start in that order. The joysticks themselves are pretty good in terms of the tension, and I do like the concaved top of it, so I think it holds your thumb pretty well on top, doesn't slip off easily. There's not a lot of travel to these joysticks, so just keep that in mind. In some games where it's expecting more travel from, say, a GameCube or PS2 analog stick, you might have some sensitivity issues that you have to work out in the options. Also, the D-pad is a tactile, clicky D-pad. I'm not a huge fan of those. I prefer the rubber membrane kind of setups where it's more mushy feeling, but I can't press all 4 directions at once, so the pivot point in the middle is at least good enough. And then at the top, we do have L1, R1, L2, R2. The back trigger buttons are analog. the front two buttons, L1, R1, are very, very clicky, so they're loud, which it can be kind of annoying if you're playing in a quiet space, maybe with someone else around you. They will definitely know if you have to hit L1 and R1. But then at the top, we also have a power or sleep wake button, the volume rockers, and then on the left is a micro HDMI out, and then the vents for the exhaust. On the bottom, we have two speakers, one on each side. We have a slot for an SD card. We have headphone jack, and then USB-C for charging and data transfer. And then on the back, we have a fairly large cutout, or a series of cutouts for the vents to bring air in. And then we have the Retroid Pocket logo next to that. And size-wise, this is a fairly compact device. They definitely took a lot of cues from the Switch Lite, but in the world of different handhelds, if you put it next to like a beast like the ROG Ally, significantly smaller, which is good. It's very close to being, I would even say, pocket-sized. My only thing is the screen on the front is going to be exposed, might get scratched up or something, depending on what else is in your pocket, and you would still have to have some fairly large pockets. But if you carry around a bag, this would fit in that bag perfectly fine. No issues there. They do sell a carrying case on their website for $10, but really just a way to protect the front screen, which is pretty nice. It's an IPS display with a resolution 750 by 1334 pixels at 60 frames per second with 500 nits of brightness, 4.7-inch touchscreen. And I think it looks pretty good. If you take, for example, the upscaling in Dolphin or Aether, the PS2 emulator, it will look pretty clean, all things considered, for the source material of these different games on this display. So I know there's always the push for going to a higher res, like a 1080p or higher, but really for these kind of games and the size of this screen with the pixels per inch, the density, it actually looks pretty good overall. I think it gets the job done. For connectivity, we discussed the HDMI output option, but it also has Bluetooth 5.2, Wi-Fi 6. It will receive official over-the-air support, so different upgrades and updates down the road, which I think there's room definitely for one in particular. The joysticks on the front are Hall effect sticks, so hopefully that means there won't be a lot of any real issues for drifting. They do sell separate joysticks on their website as well, which aren't like crazy expensive. I think they're $10 for replacement, so it could be worse in that regard. And then inside we have a fairly large 5,000 milliamp hour battery, which I was a little surprised on that front, along with the performance. So the amount of battery life you get is I'd say above average, especially for, I would say, less demanding games. Think of if you're going to get this for Game Boy or Game Boy Advance, well, I think there are better options out there in terms of price point, maybe even if you like the old school Game Boy look, like we've talked about things like the Miu Mini Plus or the Ambernick handheld. The name is kind of escaping me right now. Those might be a bit better if you're just focusing on older 16 to 32-bit games, but if you decide to play that here, you could get upwards of 8 to 10 hours on the battery that's included here, which is pretty impressive. Powering on the device, we do have Android, so think of all the different emulators you may be using on your phone. They would translate over here. In this case, though, while they do have a startup launcher to install emulators, I decided to just go out and get the fully updated versions of Dolphin and I think Aether X2. That's the PS2 emulator. And after firing up both and then just setting paths for the PS2 on BIOS and then also setting path for the different ROMs that I put on an SD card, I fired up Dolphin, which does have a very clean UI that I think is represented pretty well here for the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro. And you can see I have all my little box art set up here for different games. And as I was going through them, I was pretty happy with what I was getting. So, for example, firing up Luigi's Mansion, I ran fine at the 30 frames per second cap. I also increased the resolution up to X so that it had a 720p resolution that sat much nicer in terms of the visual clarity on the screen. I also checked out Soul Calibur, which is a very bright and colorful and sharp looking game that ran really well. There are times where when you first start it up, it has to compile and play around with some of the shaders, but after a minute or two, it basically then just cuts to smooth mostly 60 frames per second the whole way. Mario Kart, another one that ran well, but this is one where I noticed the joystick, so I'm using the left joystick to steer, was a bit sensitive, and I did have to go into the settings and kind of play around with that a little bit to find the sweet spots. So certain games with precise steering and movement, you will need to do that at least the first time. I did fire up Prince of Persia: Sands of Time because I really would like that remake to get here sooner rather than later, all the stuff it's gone through, and the game is still an absolute classic, ran perfectly fine here. That's not to say that every game is running great currently. I do wonder if just over time, maybe even just me going in and playing around with some of the more settings, I can figure it out. But F-Zero GX, unfortunately, has moments where it runs really well, and then it slows down, mostly because things are appearing in the background, different buildings, parts of the city. And then one that's notorious for being rough on hardware to emulate is Rogue Squadron. And here, same deal. The sensitivity issue definitely kicked in as well. But whenever things would happen on the screen, especially early on, it would slow to a crawl and then kick right back up to 60. So very jarring for a game like this to try to run that way. That said, as I went from game to game to game, Rogue Squadron and F-Zero ended up being more of the exception than the rule. And for the most part, every game I tried would sit at the max frame rate that the game was expecting, whether it was 30 or 60 frames per second. I know there are ways you can move the frame rate up and other things, but this was more for me of an out-of-the-box experience. Maybe I'll go back and play around with it a bit more and run some of those patches and enhancements, but for someone who just took it out of the box, tried it out immediately, you should get pretty good performance. But then going over to the PS2 is where I was a little, I don't say unsure, but not as confident. So as I started to go through, I did pick up Tekken, which, while I'm not very good at Tekken, I did at least run at the 60 frames per second mark as expected, and this is on a 2x upscale, once again to get closer to that screen resolution that we're dealing with here for Retroid. Of course, God Hand, which is a game that is severely underrated, I feel like most times, also ran really, really well. Of course, I had to fire up Dragon Ball Z Budokai Tenkaichi 3, as I have noticed if one of these handheld emulators is like right on the cusp of being able to run PS2 games and GameCube games, this one typically will show how underpowered it is. But in this case, it ran it well. Now, I did run into some weird issues here when it comes to the controls for Aether X2. And I had to go in for each game, seemingly, and remap these different buttons. As, for example, circle was in the wrong spot, so when it would tell me to mash circle, I was just hitting the wrong button, and I was just getting destroyed by Raditz in the game, which technically is canon. That's what's supposed to happen, but I felt like something was off as I was playing it here, and that's why. For some reason, it'll flip some of the controls around as you start certain games. So definitely go into the settings and double check where your mappings are for these buttons if you're using this emulator. Oh, and I'm sure many of you out there are wondering, yes, the bouncer works great, 60 frames per second. Unfortunately, it's still the bouncer at 60 frames per second. One PS2 game that unfortunately didn't do too well here, and I've noticed this with other devices, specifically for Need for Speed Underground 2, it does struggle. In this instance, it was anywhere from 20 to 30 frames at best. So unfortunate for a racing game like this that's an absolute classic. I probably will have to do some work on the back end with some of the settings, maybe to get it up to a more acceptable frame rate. This game is, I would say, worth the trouble to try to figure that out because it is one of my favorite racing games ever. But at this point, I have a handheld device that can play things like Here Comes the Pain for the PS2. I could play The Bouncer on the PS2. I could play a bunch of GameCube games with Luigi's Mansion, Mario Kart, Smash Brothers Melee, all on the go. So I'm pretty happy with this, and the thing that I was more surprised about was that the battery life wasn't terrible. Many times when you try to emulate these very demanding systems on handheld devices that run off a battery, you're looking like an hour or two, maybe 3 at best. I was playing this thing pretty consistently throughout the day for filming and doing tests, and when I finished up, it was at 50%, and I look back, and the amount of time that I recorded was just under 3 hours. So I kind of feel like this may be, when playing GameCube and PS2 games, even at high performance setting on Android, is sitting at like 5 hours or so. I'm I'm pretty happy with that. However, there was one issue that I noticed throughout my time using this, and I can't help but feel that it has something to do with sort of the way that they put this together when it comes to cooling the device. The fan is fairly loud, like at all times when you're playing any of these demanding games. So much so that if you don't have the volume up high enough or some headphones in, it would be distracting and would probably overtake the audio for your game. So I figured we might as well tear this thing down. And on the back, they have 4 screws that are kind of weird. I'm sure there's a name for the bit for this. However, I just found a Torx screw or a Torx bit that eventually matched up and was able to wedge in there and unscrew each one. After which, you're able to pop it apart with these different clips, which I will give Retroid credit. This is probably the highest quality, most solid feeling handheld I've ever bought from them. Some of their previous ones, like the 2 or even the 3, feel kind of like toys as opposed to more premium electronics, which this feels more premium overall. So that these clips, I'm sure, have something to do with that, where again, it feels more like one solid piece. But with the back off, the thing I really wanted to take a look at here was the heatsink and the fan. And unfortunately, the fan is, I just don't think, up to the task for what's being asked of it. It's a pretty small, very thin fan that its job is to move as much air as possible, and I feel like just based on the size of the fins inside of it, it has to spin incredibly fast just to get a fair amount of air through these fins on the heatsink. And to go a bit further, when I did remove the heatsink, I noticed that the thermal pads underneath are just junk. Like, they're just not very good. I mean, they were basically dissolving as I was trying to remove them to take a look at the chips themselves, which I did get some close-ups of both the CPU and the GPU here. But as I was going through, I realized, well, I'm not going to put these pads back on because they were coming up in pieces. So I'll put some, better pads down as I have them. So I cut them to form and sat them down there. But some people have mentioned that their overall temperatures have gone to the point of 80 to 90 degrees Celsius. And to me, that would be more of a failure on these pads specifically, not making good contact with the heatsink, which these ARM chips typically, I know this is actively cooled, of course, with the fan, but typically these ARM chips are still able to work within a heat threshold that shouldn't get to that point when it's actively cooled. So that's kind of where I think we're failing here with these thermal pads. That's a big point of contention I would have here for Retroid, is take a look at these pads and make sure that you're not skimping out, because if you do, it won't matter how big of a heatsink you put there if it can't transfer heat through that one key component that is connecting the chip to the heatsink, which in this case, the heatsink, it's not great. It's a very light piece of aluminum, basically. It should still be able to get the job done with a fan that would be slightly better than the one here. I feel like if they went with maybe a wider fan that's a bit larger in overall diameter, they'd be able to move air without blasting the thing at 100%, which means it would just be quieter. So this is certainly a part that they have to figure out going forward, and maybe they have to change the air path or where they're even putting the chip and the fan, or maybe what they could do technically is, rather than put the fan directly on top of the heatsink, they put the heatsink around the fan, which is typically what we'll see with things like Nintendo and their Switch Lite. I mean, they've taken a lot of cues from the Switch Lite just in terms of the body for the system. Why not just go all out, take a look at how Nintendo's actively cooling their device, and basically just copy that? But overall, I think right now, this is my favorite emulation handheld. And I know we seem to have these handhelds pop up constantly, like every other month. So by the time you're seeing this video, who knows, the Retroid Pocket 5 might be announced. But I feel like they've kind of figured this out now, and there are some tweaks, as I mentioned, for them to make. But the price point at $200, what you get out of it, I think lines up really, really well for the performance and for what I was looking for, which was a GameCube and PlayStation 2 emulator, portable emulator. If you go above 200, you start to get into the range of, well, do I spend a bit more and go up to some of the competitors that have handhelds in the price point of like $350 to $400, or do I just go get a Steam Deck and dual boot that thing and run all my emulators there? So I think where they are now is a good spot, and I would just work to refine what they have here in their next iteration that I said will probably be out in like a month or two. But let me know what you guys think about this one down below, especially if you did pick up the Retroid Pocket 4 4 Pro, or if you have a Retroid Pocket 3 and you were thinking about making the jump. Thanks, guys, for watching, and I'll see you next time.